This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you!
Boring. 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 Boring.
You got it work. Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. That's exactly what you're doing. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
Once again, Lembit Öpik here on Lembit Öpik Live on Unprecedented TV. Let's get this over with. If you haven't subscribed to Unprecedented TV on YouTube, then please do so. It's free. And when you like and subscribe, it helps us so much in so many different ways with complicated things called algorithms. But basically, it means we can do more things for you. And that is what it's all about, to be the home of free speech all over the world. Now, there's an awful lot else to watch, of course, and I'm not going to advertise those other shows because we have a huge subject to discuss today. Is it the end of NATO? Is NATO about to collapse? Certainly, there seems to be some friction between the organization, which has been mainly behind the organization called NATO, in other words, the United States of America, and the other members. Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, doesn't seem too impressed with NATO members, and he has made some rather bold statements, if you're watching this live, in the last 24 hours. And he's implying that NATO is useless. I happen to agree with him, but we'll talk about that with my guest in a moment. What is going on here? Is NATO relevant, or are they warmongering fools who still think wrongly, in my view, that Ukraine can win its conflict with Russia? What's the point of NATO? Is it a stabilizing force, or is it making the world worse? Joining me now is a man who can answer all of those questions. It's Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus, good to see you.
Hello there, Lembit, and what a way 2026 has begun.
It's incredible, really. Within a few just days, we're already looking at the potential collapse of NATO. Now, let's set the scene here. NATO's been under a lot of strain, and that's because its leader, I don't even think you can call him a leader, Mark Rutte, their very weird man with a very strange hand gesture. By the way, if Elon Musk did that, then he'd be accused of all kinds of things. But apparently Mark Rutte can do that with his hand and nobody complains. But he keeps going on about war being peace in an Orwellian way. He wants the West to spend 1/20th of all its money on war. He said things like lethal force makes the world safer. He's learned nothing about the arms race. But he's going on moaning about that and seems to be complaining about somebody who he called the daddy. How embarrassing, Donald Trump, and tried to curry favor with him. But it's not going very well for them as far as I can see. It seems to me that they keep having these meetings, coalition of the wilting or the Wallies, as you've called them. What is the big picture here? Let's start with the simplest question. They had another meeting, if you're watching this live, just a few days ago about Ukraine, and they still seem to think they can win.
Well, first of all, we shouldn't attach importance to the words of NATO chiefs. For example, the incumbent, Mark Rutte, or previous ones, such as George Robertson, because NATO chiefs are not in charge of NATO. They are mouthpieces. Mark Rutte, for example, has no military experience. He has no military competence. Likewise, George Robertson has no military experience and no military competence. So again, when they speak, they are relaying the words of the real masters of NATO. And of course, we are principally talking about the Americans. As regards the future of NATO, well, it is evident that Donald Trump does not have a favorable opinion on the Western military bloc. And it is conceivable, more than conceivable, in fact, that NATO could demise, and NATO, the death of NATO could come about from within. Why? Because the issue of Greenland is becoming more and more serious. It is becoming more and more prominent. If Donald Trump, if America was to annex Greenland, then that would mean the end of NATO. No ifs or buts. It would be the end of NATO. Why? Because it would mean that one NATO member, namely Denmark, has had a part of its territory annexed by another NATO member. So this is a real possibility.
Now, that's an interesting point. There's Donald Trump celebrating his Venezuelan gambit. We'll come back to that in a short while. What's interesting about what you've said, and for those who conceivably haven't been aware of this, Donald Trump has said that he might be willing to use military force in order to basically take control of Greenland. And this has led to European leaders to pledge to defend Greenland's sovereignty. I find this all very peculiar because Donald Trump knows that Greenland's in NATO. Greenland keeps saying, we got no problem. The Americans can do anything they jolly well want here. They're welcome. But Donald Trump keeps saying he wants to buy Greenland. And if he can't buy Greenland, he's going to get it. What do you think he's actually playing at?
Well, first of all, we need to be aware that ever since the late 1940s, Greenland has been de facto an American state. The Americans have a very large surveillance network in Greenland, and the American Navy routinely docks in Greenland. That is something the Soviet Union was aware of, and that is something that modern day Russia is aware of. So if the Americans do proceed and annex Greenland, it will simply turn Greenland from being de facto a part of America to legally part of America. There will be no change on the ground. But Trump...
The Americans, sorry to interrupt you, the Americans actually have a base there, at least one base there, haven't they? They're already fully installed on the island of Greenland.
They have numerous bases there. They have an array of bases, but in particular, it is the listening, it is the surveillance installations which they have in Greenland, which make it so important to the American military doctrine. That is why, as I said, today, as we speak, Greenland is de facto a state of the United States. So if Trump does go ahead and annex it, this is not going to change anything on the ground. The Russians will not object. They will not object because they already know that, in so many words, Greenland belongs to America. But I also think that the Russians would be relatively mute if the Americans were to annex Greenland, like the Russians were relatively mute when America carried out its illegal actions in Venezuela. Why? Because we have to view the Kremlin's response in the context of Ukraine. Because under the Trump administration, America is moving away from Ukraine. No one can...
Let's come back to Ukraine in a minute.
Yes.
This is all quite complicated for people who aren't necessarily that au fait with the nuances, but we're going to get to the heart of all of this. Just staying with Ukraine, Greenland. I'm doing it now. Greenland does seem to be a bit of a remote outpost, but it's geographically useful, isn't it? That's why they go on about it. And the mainstream media has gone quite crazy. The mainstream media in the West certainly seems to be suggesting that Europe is right and America is wrong. But it's hard because it's almost impossible to tell where people like Keir Starmer stands. We'll come to him in a minute. But the Danes are technically associated with Greenland at the moment. Greenland is technically some kind of a territory of Denmark, isn't it?
Yes, yes, indeed, it is. Yes,
Looks like a beautiful place.
it is. Greenland is of immense geostrategic importance. Look at where it is placed. All vessels traveling to and from the Atlantic Ocean go past Greenland. That is why the Americans, are following the Second World War, ensured that Greenland would be one massive American surveillance installation. So from Greenland, not only can they track Russian vessels, for example, Russian nuclear submarines in the Atlantic Ocean, they can also track Russian vessels in the North Sea, for example, in the Barents Sea. Now, of course, Russia has surveillance installations where they can track American vessels, for example, American nuclear submarines. But nonetheless, having Greenland at the disposal of American intelligence and American military really gives the Americans a very big advantage in the world.
Yeah, this is the thing I was reckoning on as well. And what they've got there, I think, is something like 57,000 residents who live in places like that. 160 kilometers, I think it is, of roads. A lot of snow, and most of Greenland looks like glaciers. If we can get that one up, yeah, there we are. That's what most of Greenland looks like. 2,500 kilometers from north to south. We checked this up, and 1,300 kilometers wide, and it's got certainly hundreds, maybe thousands of meters thick glacier on it. So really, it's only of strategic importance along the edges. To what extent do you think that Trump is trying to get the resources underneath all of that ice?
The Americans are aware, Trump is aware, that America is running low on petroleum, coupled together with the reality that the petrodollar is in trouble because the BRIC countries, for example, announced that they will start trading oil between themselves in their own currencies.
That was inevitable.
And it is inevitable. So the Americans have to find new sources of oil. They have to find new sources of energy. And of course, Greenland is a major outlet, a major potential outlet. But for the time being, it serves as I said, a massive listening post, a massive surveillance installation for America.
Okay, so primarily it's of military concern.
Yes.
We now have heard, if you're watching this live, very short while ago, we've heard that essentially the Americans have pretty much, or Trump specifically, have pretty much criticized NATO as impotent and just not effective. He does really seem to be very aggressive when it comes to NATO. Why is he so dismissive? What does he benefit by saying NATO is useless, Europe's useless?
I think the Americans are starting to turn their strategic attention to other parts of the world, principally the South China Sea. I think that is clear. Indeed, that started to happen under Obama, and it occurred under Trump's first tenure in power. It then continued during the Biden administration. I don't believe that Trump views Russia as an adversary of the United States. Indeed, the American military doctrine in 2025 was amended to reflect that the Americans do not regard Russia as an enemy. However, there is tension building, very serious tension building between America and China. But on the other hand, the American and Chinese economies are interlinked. And after 1 year in office under Trump, the American investment and trade relationship with China has grown. So it is a very peculiar relationship between America and China. And likewise, the Chinese talk about how America is a potential threat to Chinese national security. But at the same time, the Chinese are more than happy to continue their trade and investment policy with America. Indeed, they are very keen to keep on deepening their economic relationship with America. So it is a strange relationship between Washington and Beijing.
But it does make sense if, like me, and I think like you, Donald Trump recognizes that the old Western Empire is dying, and the Western Northern Empire is dying, and the Southern Eastern Empire is growing. So he's going to be better off with the other countries, India. They're not all, of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, but India and Russia and China and South America. That's the place to be. We'll talk about the rather interesting things he's done in Venezuela shortly. If that's the case, that makes sense that he would say, I'm not interested in NATO anymore, because NATO is part of the old guard.
Yes, it would make sense. But as you alluded to just now, his actions in Venezuela says something else. We have to be mindful that there is an empire in the world at present, the strongest empire, maybe the strongest empire in history, and that is the Yankee Empire, an empire which is bristling with nuclear weapons. So whilst the Yankee Empire might not regard NATO in the same light as it once did, nonetheless, the Yankee Empire is continuing to feed itself at the expense of others. On the other hand, however, I still believe that behind the scenes in Washington, there is a struggle of some kind going on between the American deep state and the Trump administration. Sometimes the Trump administration gets what it wants, for example, starting to distance America from Ukraine. But sometimes the deep state gets what it wants. For example, when it comes to Venezuela, Venezuela has changed how we see the Trump administration to a great extent.
I want to, just before we go to the break, I want to share with you something which has been issued by one of the mainstream media, if you're watching this live in the last 24 hours. And it's actually quite dramatic. Listen to this.
Hit out at NATO in the last few moments. He has put a post on the Trump Truth Social saying that Russia and China have zero fear of NATO without the United States. And he doubts that NATO would be there for us if we really needed them. Everyone is lucky, he says, that I have rebuilt our military, talking about American military, in my first term and continue to do so. We will be always there for NATO if they won't be there for us. Well, that comes, of course, as America appears to have intercepted a tanker, a Venezuelan-linked tanker in the Atlantic after pursuing it for more than 2 weeks. Within the last hour, the United Nations European Command has confirmed the capture, saying that the vessel had violated US sanctions.
Well, that's an interesting point. And Donald Trump is pretty much openly saying he's got no faith in NATO.
As I said, he clearly does not like NATO, but at the same time, America is NATO. NATO is America. If America, hypothetically speaking, this won't happen, but if, hypothetically speaking, America was to withdraw from NATO, then NATO would be dead in the water. Britain knows that. France knows that. Germany knows that. Poland knows that. That is why, behind the scenes, I have no doubt that the British establishment and the French establishment, along with the American deep state, are trying to keep Trump with NATO and in Europe. But, as I said, clearly the Trump administration has a negative opinion of the Western military bloc.
Hardly surprising. Stay with us. That is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. We'll go back to him in a minute. Somebody else who's definitely worth watching. It's Tim Scott, who is the Supremo at the Freedom Association and supreme at finding stories you may not have noticed. He does Tim Scott Uncancelled. Watch this. Got Uncancelled, usually on a Saturday, but we're going to increase the frequency with which we put those shows on. Have you noticed, by the way, Marcus, if you watch the British Broadcasting Corporation's news channel, if you watch it for an hour, you see everything twice or four times. And we worry about showing a show twice in a week. It's rhetorical. I don't want to have a go at the BBC more than I normally do. My main criticism of them is that they don't keep to their charter. They're not objective. A quick question on that. We were talking about NATO and so forth before the break. I get the feeling that they don't dare to question the quality of NATO, and so therefore they put rubbish like this out. Coalition are willing to present Ukraine peace plan. Can we just have a chat about that? Then we'll talk about Venezuela after that. There they are again. I mean, that front row. If they were on my side, I'd surrender. I mean, you got Macron, Starmer, Zelensky, and Merz there. I think that's Merz from Germany, and they're just so incompetent. You were saying that without America, NATO is dead. Well, frankly, that's why. It's because the front row there. Oh, and then you got von der Leyen and all the others, the scroungers in Brussels who want everybody else to pay for their military.
Coalition of the willing is impotent. Why? Because Russia has said, never, ever will it allow NATO troops or the troops of any other country in the world in Ukraine. End of subject. That is why coalition of the willing means nothing in practice. The British know that, the French know that, the Americans know that, and the Russians know that. There will be no peace agreement between America and Russia regarding Ukraine. So that means there will be no opportunity for NATO troops to go into Ukraine. But put aside a potential peace agreement between Washington and Moscow concerning Ukraine. Again, I reiterate, the Russians will never permit NATO troops or foreign troops from any other country in Ukraine. The Russians entered Ukraine. They began their military operation there to ensure the national security of the Russian Federation, to ensure that for example, no other navy could set up bases at Odessa or Oshakov. Never, ever will you see one British soldier in Ukraine. Never will you see an American soldier in Ukraine or a French soldier in Ukraine. Of course, there are NATO troops in Ukraine, but they are there unofficially. But that aside, never will there be NATO forces in Ukraine.
Why do we see this repeated, in my view, self-delusion by these foolish amateurs, fourth division politicians, Zelensky and Starmer and the others, who seem to still think that pouring endless amounts of our money into Ukraine will lead to a different outcome other than more death, more land loss and defeat?
Firstly, coalition of the willing is an exercise in propaganda. It is a way of the British ruling elite and their French counterparts saying to their respective publics that Ukraine
Well, there has been a provocation because the Western media report with pride and joy that Ukraine is making lots of drone attacks against Russia, and then we won't go into all the details, but they seem to be really happy that there are all these problems. Moscow claims hundreds of drones intercepted, all these problems for Russia, and they almost celebrate the assassination of generals and so on in Moscow. Why isn't that a provocation which is causing strain? And why isn't that causing strain between America and NATO as well? Or is it?
Well, Western mainstream media is neither free nor independent. It is a weapon, one of the many weapons that the globalists have, and it's one of their most dangerous weapons. And I use the word media in a very loose way, because the golden rule of journalism is impartiality. From day one of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, nearly 4 years ago, British mainstream media, for example, BBC, Sky News, Channel 4 News, The Times, The Telegraph, The Guardian, openly support Ukraine. Well, that means they're not impartial. That means they're in breach of the golden rule of journalism. Again, impartiality. When it comes to celebrating the attacks, Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia, well, they're not journalists. They are activists. So naturally, they are going to celebrate that. And the Kremlin is very aware of that. And in regard to Ukrainian drone attacks on Putin's residence, or the alleged drone attack on Putin's residence, well, I approach this in a very brutal manner, Lembit. There is a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, a proxy war between Russia and NATO. The Russians call it a special military operation, but it is a war. Therefore, I expect NATO's Ukrainian army to launch attacks inside Russia. It is a war, but you don't expect journalists to be celebrating it. But again, they're not proper journalists. These are activists.
Have your say in the X feed, or if you prefer, go to the feed on Lembit Öpik Live here on the show. Try and get to them if I can as well. Let's talk about Venezuela, and you were mentioning that before. First of all, removed from this argument, US attack on Greenland would mean the end of NATO, says Danish Prime Minister. But now we've got form, because there has been a US attack on Venezuela, and Venezuela's got some pretty powerful allies. We've just been talking about one of them. There's Putin, Vladimir Putin, who must be rubbing his hands about South America, because now both he and Xi Jinping in China can say, you see, without security guarantees from us, you're in danger of attack by America.
The world has again witnessed another act of American military aggression against an independent sovereign country. And of course, I'm referring to Venezuela. The Americans, the Trump administration, launched a military attack against Venezuela, not to remove a so-called dictator, not to bring peace, freedom, and democracy to the Venezuelan people. After all of that is claptrap. The reason is to take control of Venezuela's oil. Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of oil in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, America is running dangerously low on petroleum. The American petrodollar, which since the 1970s has forced other countries, oil-producing countries in the world, to trade in the US dollar. The petrodollar is in trouble. That's why the Americans attacked Venezuela. The situation, as I speak, in Venezuela is opaque. It's very unclear. I do not believe that the American special forces were able, within a few hours of American airstrikes, or during a few hours of American airstrikes, to penetrate Maduro's heavily fortified bunker, which would have been guarded by hundreds of heavily armed Venezuelan troops and personal bodyguards to Maduro. No, I suspect, or I believe, that there could have been a negotiated surrender between Maduro and the American government in advance of the American act of aggression against Venezuela, or the Venezuelan military betrayed Maduro. They went over to Washington's side. But again, the situation, as I speak, is very unclear. But the Kremlin's response to what happened to Maduro, to what happened to Venezuela, was relatively muted. And that is interesting, because Russia and Venezuela have a strategic partnership with each other. So why was the Kremlin so quiet about what the Americans did?
What's your answer?
The Russian response has to be seen in the context of Ukraine. The Trump administration, against the wishes of the American deep state, is slowly disengaging America from Ukraine. No one can seriously argue that the Trump administration is as involved in Ukraine as the Biden administration was. So the Kremlin doesn't want to say anything that could put the Trump administration in a difficult situation, whereby the Trump administration would have to put America back firmly in Ukraine.
Well, that makes sense, because this is a picture from the blockade around Venezuela by Russia, and sorry, not by Russia, by America. My apologies. But what I was going to say is, presumably Russia can now point to the Venezuelan gambit and the Greenland gambit and say, with Venezuela, we're simply trying to correct a rogue state.
Yes, they can. And no one is seriously going to argue that America is not a rogue state. In fact, we should more accurately refer to it as the Yankee Empire. But in regard to the American naval blockade of Venezuela, it is reminiscent of the Kennedy administration's naval blockade of Cuba in 1962, which Kennedy referred to as a quarantine. That blockade was illegal.
Just a quick one on that one. There is a difference, though, because Venezuela wasn't trying to base nuclear weapons on behalf of Russia or the Soviet Union in it. And America always argued, and John F. Kennedy always argued, they just didn't want nukes 60 miles off the coast of America.
That is correct. But why did Khrushchev deploy Soviet ICBMs to Cuba? Because the Americans had nuclear warheads in Turkey. Turkey shared a border with the Soviet Union. That's the reason why Khrushchev deployed Soviet ICBMs to Cuba in the first place. And remember, the real reason, the ultimate reason why Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet ICBMs was not because the Kennedy administration put into writing it would never invade Cuba. It's because there was a private agreement between the Kennedy administration and the Kremlin, where the Kennedy administration said in private they would withdraw American nuclear warheads from Turkey, which they did. But again, we must be very clear that the American naval blockade of Venezuela is illegal. And now we are hearing that a tanker which was flying the Russian flag not far from Greenland has been captured by the Americans. Now, what I can tell you, Lembit, is this. British mainstream media is reporting this incorrectly. Whilst this vessel was flying the Russian flag, it is not owned by Russia. Maritime law is complex, and I'm certainly no expert on maritime law, but the Americans would never dare touch a Russian vessel, never. But a vessel which does not belong to Russia, but is simply temporarily displaying the Russian flag, can be captured by the Americans. And the American surveillance installations in Greenland would have played a major part in the Americans locating, identifying, and capturing this vessel.
This is the vessel here, I think. If we can just get that up again. Not sure if we can. I'm not sure this is, I think this is a stock shot. We don't know how much was on it and what was on it. Yeah, that's the one there. But one thing we learn is that the British have been involved in the seizing of this tanker. Now, surely that means that Vladimir Putin can now say, well, the British are also endorsing American activities against Venezuela, so the British can't complain about our special military operation in Ukraine either. It's kind of a convoluted argument, but essentially what Russia can say is, well, America, you've just done it in Venezuela, so shut up.
Well, the American ruling elite and the British ruling elite are the principal violators of the United Nations Charter and international law in general.
Why do you say that?
Why? Well, for example, let's take the last 30 years. Look how many countries, America and Britain, attacked, militarily attacked, either invaded or bombed or sanctioned or carried out coups in. From the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to Iraq, to Libya, to Ukraine in February of 2014. They violated the independence and sovereignty of Ba'athist Syria under President Assad by arming to the teeth Islamist terrorists and other jihadists and sending them into Syria from Turkey. America and Britain do not have a legal leg to stand on when it comes to international law. The British, of course, proclaim themselves as the defenders of international law. No one listens to that in the world. The problem, Lembit, is that in their defense, the British ruling elite have American military muscle. And the Americans believe in one thing: might is right. And I will say this about the Trump administration. I respect them for being honest, because they openly express disdain for the United Nations Charter and international law. They openly say, we will do what we want. Now, Obama, Clinton, and Bush, they were all as violent in their actions when it came to American foreign policy. But on the surface, they said, we respect international law, etc., etc. But as I said, they were just as violent. But at least the Trump administration is more honest. But nonetheless, with what happened in Venezuela, the Trump administration demonstrated a brutal approach, a very cynical approach. Whether the American deep state forced the Trump administration into doing that, I have no idea. Possibly, but that is not to excuse Trump, Vance, Hegseth, and Rubio, because all four men are now criminals under international law because of the military aggression they unleashed on Venezuela and because they captured the legitimate leader of another country, a president of another country.
That's your claim. It hasn't been tested in court, but I understand why you say it, and it's no stronger than the accusations made against others, others who aren't considered friends of the West. One of the points I make in passing is, if America can arrest Maduro for claims of corruption, nothing's been proved, then why can't Russia arrest Zelensky for claims of corruption too? There's a certain symmetry to that. There are, of course, people who are totally immersed in the propaganda of the West would think that's an appalling analogy. But Maduro has not yet been found guilty, and he was abducted from his country. He says kidnapped. And in the same way, Zelensky hasn't been found guilty of corruption, but a lot of people around him seem to have a lot of corruption questions to answer.
The reality concerning the American ruling elite and the British ruling elite can be summarized as follows. One rule for me, another for thee. Can you imagine the response of British mainstream media, for example, if the Russians captured Zelensky and said he would be put on trial? Can you imagine the ferocious response? But when it comes to Maduro, their response is muted. And isn't it interesting that their response is muted concerning a foreign leader who did not align his country's foreign policy with that of the West's foreign policy objectives? How coincidental? Well, of course, it's not a coincidence. When will an American president or a British prime minister or a British monarch be put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity? Who supported Islamist terrorist groups in Bosnia? Who supported Albanian organized crime and terrorism in Kosovo and Metohija? Who invaded Iraq? Who placed sanctions on Iraq, which caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, including a great many children? Who turned Libya into a failed state? And they did so by arming Al-Qaeda. Who armed Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria? The British and the Americans. And yet, because might is right, you won't see a British monarch or a British prime minister or an American president standing trial. That is a sad reality. But the Russians will turn around and say that is why Russia is taking the action in Ukraine. You can never trust one word which emanates from the mouths of Western leaders, even if they put it into writing. Even if America was to put into writing that Ukraine would never be admitted as a member to NATO, the Russians would never believe that, because the Americans violate agreements. They violated the anti-ballistic missile. They withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia in 2002. They withdrew from the intermediate nuclear forces treaty in 2019 with Russia. Those two treaties were major cornerstones in ensuring peace between the two superpowers, and yet the Americans destroyed both treaties. No, so you will see the Russians take any action they want in Ukraine, any action.
Finally, is this the end of NATO? The US attack on Greenland would mean end of NATO, says Danish Prime Minister. But even before that, with Donald Trump saying that NATO won't defend America and clearly expressing cynicism and exasperation with NATO, is NATO finished, do you think?
I don't believe it is finished. There will not be an attack on NATO. So on that basis...
NATO... An attack on NATO or an attack on Greenland?
Well, when I should have been clearer, yes. There will be no Russian attack on NATO.
Oh, right.
However, as I said earlier, if America is to annex Greenland, then NATO is dead. So that is one way NATO could die. America will not withdraw from NATO. The American deep state will simply not permit Trump to do that. But there's another way NATO could die. More and more people across Europe realize that NATO, along with the European Union, is an occupying power of Europe, is a dangerous power occupying Europe. NATO does not serve the interests of the ancient nations of Europe. So it could be that in time, patriotic or nationalist governments come to power in countries across Europe, and they themselves withdraw their countries from NATO.
And this man, Mark Rutte, all at the best of times, still heads up NATO.
but Lembit, he's no different to George Robertson. I mean, if people don't know who George Robertson is, he's a British Labour parliamentarian who, to say is stupid, is a gross understatement. The man is an absolute imbecile, and yet he was made NATO chief. Mark Rutte is an absolute imbecile. Just listen to Mark Rutte speak. Listen to George Robertson speak, and you can only conclude one thing. The pair of them are complete and utter major morons. What does George Robertson and Mark Rutte know about military affairs? Nothing. They don't need to know about military affairs. All they need to do is read from a prepared script, and they are paid a great deal of money for doing so.
Always a great pleasure to have you on the show. Not everyone will agree, of course, but we're into free speech here, and overall we hope to find a balance. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, many thanks for your time. That is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. You have your say as well. Maybe you disagree with every word you said. That's the beauty of free speech. You don't have to agree. You have to think for yourself. My personal view is that many precedents have now been set by the West, which to some extent vindicate the actions of Russia. Because if America can abduct a leader of a country with 30 million people living there on the basis of criminality, Russia could say, that's pretty big incursion into another country's affairs. And that's one reason we're feeling a bit more justified in what we're doing in Ukraine. But you may have a different view. Over time, we'll try and get into that. Do please watch Warren Thornton's daily review as well. He often covers these points. And please like and subscribe at Unprecedented TV on YouTube as well. So much to watch here. Do please share, copy. You'll never get into trouble with me in copyright terms. We're here to share the truth. And although the truth costs money to broadcast, you're free to think the truth as you see best. I'm Lembit Öpik. That was Lembit Öpik Live here on Unprecedented TV. Have a good day.
Immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages.